Hi, I'm Debbie Anderson, owner of Victorian House Scones. Today we're here in my home kitchen to learn how to put together a batch of scones. As we put this batch of scones together today, we're going to be using our original recipe scone mix. But whether you are making scones or biscuits, all the principles apply. Whether it's a mix that you use or whether it's your own favorite recipe passed down through your family. So, when you put together a batch of scones, the first thing you do is start by measuring all of your dry ingredients into a bowl. In this case, I've already done that because I'm using our original recipe scone mix. So you put it all in the bowl, and the next thing you're going to do is to cut in the butter. What I've done is to go ahead and pre-grate and then freeze the butter because I want that butter to go in frozen and to stay frozen. So you have this lovely pillow of frozen butter, which now will cut in very quickly with a pastry cutter. What we're aiming for is not to have it completely disappear into a fine powdery mix, but we'd like to be able to see little nubbins of butter about the size of a grain of rice. And at this point, that's what we have here. So if you take a look at this, it's a little bit chunky. You can see your nubbins of butter, and that's exactly what we want. When that frozen butter hits the hot oven and melts, it's going to leave a pocket of air and give off a puff of steam, and there is how you get the lightness to your scone. Now, the next thing we're going to do is add the buttermilk. So you never add all of it all at once. This recipe will call for a cup, and I'm going to add about 3/4 of that and start blending it. I used to do this with a mixer and learned that in the long run, I prefer it without a mixer because, again, no matter how careful I was with the mixer, it had a habit of overworking the dough. And ultimately, the scones weren't quite as tender and quite as nice as I think they are when you do it by hand. Now, because the butter is frozen, it has immediately turned the bowl and the flour cold. And as a result, it's a little bit tougher to get it to take up the liquid. So here's where you do a couple of things. We've gone about as far as I can go with the rubber spatula. So at this point, one clean hand and one hand only is going to go into the bowl. But the other thing is this is where your judgment takes over and you begin to add just a little more buttermilk, again, because you're dealing with a very cold flour and it's just not wanting to take up the buttermilk quite as readily as if it was all at room temperature. So we're just going to go in and continue with one hand only to pull the dry nubbins of mix and butter off the bottom of the bowl and start pulling it all together. And each time I'm adding maybe a teaspoon of buttermilk at a time, so not very much, and not enough that it really is going to change the recipe in any way. Part of the thing about baking is that it's also very environmentally dependent. So a hot kitchen changes things, high humidity changes things, very dry air changes things. So while we would all like to think that baking is an exact science, it's a precise science, but it's not an exact science. And you just need to be able to use your judgment and know what you're looking for as this all pulls together. And we're just about there. It's beginning to clump. It wants to stick to my fingers. And we've just about got most of the dry off the bottom of the bowl. Okay, so we've got our ball of dough all together. Now what we're going to do is turn it out onto a floured board. So we take our cutting board and add just enough flour to it We don't want to add a lot of flour to the dough. What we want to do is take the sticky off of the dough. I'm ultimately going to turn this into 16 wedge-shaped scones. And what I want to do is divide this dough mass in half and then go ahead and pat each half into a circle of dough. Since I would like all of my scones to be roughly the same size, I'm going to first start by cutting it in what I think is half, but we're just going to go ahead and weigh each half of the dough. And we're going to go ahead and form this into a flattened ball of dough. Now, as you pat this out, what you don't want to do is you don't want to roll it with a rolling pin, and you don't want to beat on it too much. You actually want to treat this as if you were handling a new baby. Your dough is sweet and tender, and you would like to keep it that way. So we've got it into a circle of dough, roughly an inch in thickness, so 6-ish inches in diameter, and we're just going to go ahead and cut this into wedges. And quarters, and then eighths. At this point, we're going to put them on a cookie sheet, and what I need to do and want to do is to freeze the dough prior to baking. Again, it's going to help keep the butter frozen, and it lets you bake only what you want when you want them, so you are never bound to baking 16 scones or however many your recipe will make all at once. So I'm just going to set these onto the cookie sheet. As soon as we get the others cut, these will go into the freezer. They'll freeze firm in a couple of hours. Even if you don't want to freeze the dough and bake later, but you want scones today, you're still going to be better off setting that cookie sheet in the freezer for something like 15 to 20 minutes and letting that butter firm back up and the dough rest a little bit before you go ahead and slide them into the oven. You want to make sure that you're using a sharp knife so that these edges that are cut don't pull down into themselves, but that you see a nice sharp cut on the edges, and that will help ensure that when they bake, they rise and not get caught on each other and sort of tumble over sideways and give you somewhat misshapen scones. If you're using a circle cutter, a biscuit cutter to cut your dough, again, you want to be sure it's sharp and you want to go straight down into the dough. You don't want a twisting action because that twisting action will start to bind the edges together. And as those get bound up, you begin to get lopsided and cattywampus type looking biscuits. So these are ready to head into the freezer. Once frozen, you can either bag them up and return them to the freezer for later baking. At that point, what you would want to do is label your bag. Make sure you put the date made on the bag, the oven temperature, and the flavor. These obviously are just simply plain scones. If you're going to bake immediately, you go ahead, once you've let them chill out for about 15 or 20 minutes, you would take a fresh cookie sheet, line it with parchment paper, put as many scones on it as you want to bake, and put it into a preheated oven. And you want to make sure that that oven temperature is preheated to the temperature your recipe or mix calls for. And then go ahead and put that cookie sheet with your frozen scone dough into the oven. You'll want to go ahead and set the timer for a couple of minutes less, because even though you know it will take longer to bake because the dough has been frozen, you want to make sure that you don't overbake them because you didn't hear the timer go off. So set the timer for 3 or 4 minutes less than the actual baking time, and then go ahead and check on them and pull them just as they are finished baking. So that's it. You're ready to bake fresh scones. If you have any questions, you're welcome to contact me. I can be found on email at sconelady@victorianhousescones.com, or you are welcome to visit our website, and that would be www.victorianhousescones.com.